Um, I'd like to talk about three things today. Firstly, scenario planning and its history, because it really is a useful tool in these uncertain times to think in terms of multiple futures rather than try and forecast the future. Secondly, I'd like to talk about the flags which were changing the world before the pandemic that I outlined in a book called Flag Watching, which I published in 2015. And then lastly, I'd like to talk about the coronavirus scenarios that I published in two articles on News 24, and the implications for South Africa and business. The story starts in 1960. A, um, a man called Herman Kahn wrote a book called On Thermonuclear War, Thinking the Unthinkable. He worked for the RAND Corporation, which advises the US armed forces. And he produced this book out of the blue, which was a huge hit in the United States. And I'd like to concentrate on the subtitle, Thinking the Unthinkable, because that was the subtitle of the book, where he introduced scenario planning and played a very detailed scenario of a nuclear conflict with Russia. And 2 years later, it very nearly happened because Kennedy very nearly went to war with Khrushchev over the missiles in Cuba. So the unthinkable almost became reality 2 years later. And that's the great power of scenario planning, is to take something that's unthinkable and actually put forward as a story, a plausible narrative before that unthinkable happens. One of his students, because he set up his own institute, Herman, was Pierre Wack, who was a Frenchman, W-A-C-K, and he was probably the greatest scenario planner of all time because he took it from a military setting and he installed it in Royal Dutch Shell and captured both oil price shocks in the 1970s for Shell. The second one they acted on, and they invested heavily in new stocks of oil and made a lot of money out of that. And so Pierre became a legend in London in the late 70s. And he came to our attention as the largest mining company in the world, Anglo-American. And we asked him to come to Johannesburg when he was about to retire from Shell and give us a lecture on scenario planning, because we thought we could much more usefully use this tool for gold and diamonds and all the stuff that we produced, rather than just forecasting the future. And he arrived in Johannesburg in the early 80s. He spoke to our executive committee. They were blown away by his presentation, not just by what he said, but the way he looked. He had hooded eyes, he had a goatee beard, he looked like a futurist. And before he spoke, he said, "Can I light up?" So we all thought he was going to produce a go-the-wise cigarette, instead of which he produced two incense sticks, lit them and said, "I think more clearly about the future when I'm smelling incense." So we hired him on the spot. The chairman of the executive looked around the room, and I was the secretary of the executive at the time, and he said, "Clem, why don't you look after this function?" And I was, life completely changed for me, because I got to know Pierre very well. He had a remarkable team around the world who assisted us. And then obviously we had our own employees inside Anglo. And in the mid-80s, we produced an exercise called The World in South Africa in the 1990s, where we looked at scenarios for the 1990s. And one of the world scenarios we called Imperial Twilight, where the Soviet Union disappeared. It did in 1990, and that was a very important release mechanism, I think, for South Africa, because there were a lot of people in government at the time who were very conscious of sort of Reds under the beds and communist threats. And you know, it's unlikely that we might even have gone into transition if the Soviet Union hadn't actually disappeared like it did. So it was an important global scenario. In South Africa, we produced two scenarios: the high road of negotiation leading to a political settlement in South Africa getting back into the global economy, and the low road of confrontation leading to civil war and a wasteland where the government tried to impose a model on the rest of South Africa, and the rest of South Africa resisted. And I was deputed to go around the country and give talks on these two scenarios in the context of the global stuff, which I did. And I have to say, many, many people said exactly what that subtitle of Herman Kahn's book said. They said it's unthinkable. We don't know why Anglo is sending a highly paid manager like you around the country to spin a fairy tale, because the National Party will never get together with the ANC and negotiate the future. But they did, and they did it starting in 1990, 5 years ahead of the kind of schedule we had inside our presentation. And indeed, just before he was released, I had 5 hours with Nelson Mandela at Victor Verster in Palm, because he wanted to hear the scenarios. And yeah, I said to the Anglo directors when I got back, you know, this guy's good. And if he ever is released, because he didn't tell me he was going to be released the following month, I think he'll make a very good president. And, you know, he was. And what really struck me about him was his passion for reconciliation, despite being in jail for 27 years. So it really did the job, this presentation, because it didn't change South Africa, but what it did was introduce a scenario of hope, which is very much the point in that first presentation today, to give people, because everybody was talking about the inevitability of civil war. All the foreign journalists were, everybody was. So to introduce a scenario of hope helped change the conversation from one of we'll never be able to negotiate to, oh, maybe somehow we can start the whole process. Anyway, a disappointment for me was, having had that success, we dropped the methodology inside Anglo, and the first opportunity I thought of reviving it was when I read a thesis by a young woman called Chantal Ilbury. She was doing an executive MBA at the Graduate School of Business in Cape Town. And her thesis was on scenario planning for small business. And one of the points she emphasized in her thesis was it had to be made a more practical tool in order to be acceptable to small business. And I read the thesis and I said, Chantal, let's write a book together. And so we did. In 5 months, we produced this book, The Mind of a Fox. It was published in June 2001. And we chose that title because there was a Greek poet called Archilochus, who in 650 BC wrote the following line: "The hedgehog knows one big thing, the fox knows many things." Why he chose that metaphor, heaven only knows, but we thought it was very good to illustrate the difference between trying to forecast the future, which a hedgehog does with one big forecast, and foxes who look at multiple futures, look at the flags, weigh up the probabilities, and are totally dynamic. And interestingly, 2 years after we published our book, Philip Tetlock, who was probably the best American futurist at the time, published a paper where he analyzed 28,000 expert forecasts in America and used the fox-hedgehog analogy and said foxes completely win in terms of the accuracy of their scenarios, rather than hedgehogs who stick to inflexible forecasts. So we got some very strong backing in the United States. Incidentally, in the book, we had a letter to George Bush in which we said that part of his legacy as president would be determined by the speed and quality of his response to certain extreme, unthinkable futures that might come his way. And we nominated as his most unthinkable future a massive terrorist strike on a Western city, which would turn his world upside down. And of course, it happened 3 months after we published the book. We didn't have any idea that it would happen so soon, but it did. And when the Americans did a literature search, they found that our book was the only one published anywhere in the world that in a formal letter to the US president said this is your biggest threat. And it then obviously led to lots of work that Chantal and I have done around the world using this technique of trying to identify the flags which will change the future and give you a feel of which scenario is in play. Obviously, look at the different possible futures in terms of scenarios, and then most importantly, consider what options you're going to exercise to chase the opportunities and to avoid the threats posed by each scenario. I think one of the most historic sessions I did was in 2006. I was asked when I was in Beijing to go to the Central Party School, which is the inner sanctum of the Chinese Communist Party, because they want to be introduced to the methodology so that they could road test their 5-year economic plans, which were written at the school. And after I'd done the presentation, I said, well, let's do it for real. What is the scenario you hope or fear most? And they said an American recession, because they had $1.75 trillion worth of bonds, US bonds, and they were very worried about America's financial state at the time. So we wrote a recession scenario, not a crash, a recession scenario, but the flag that they chose was property values in America, because they said 2/3 of American economy is consumer spending. The biggest asset that a consumer has is his or her house. And if that goes down in value, they'll stop spending, and that will send the American economy into a tailspin. So there was a thing called the Case-Shiller Index, which we watched. And in the last quarter of 2006, it leveled out after rising for 20 years. And in the first quarter of 2007, it fell in the first 3 months. And so we lifted the probability of that scenario to 50%. And then when it had another 3 months worth of fall, we jumped it to 80%. And that was before the stock market started declining, which was in September 2007. And obviously, we ended up with the crash of Lehman Brothers in September 2008. And the scenario, to all intents and purposes, had materialized. But it showed how great the technique is at getting you ahead of the crowd, because we were giving a very high probability to a recession scenario before the crash actually happened. So what are the flags now that our clients around the world have raised with us before the pandemic hit? Well, the first one, obviously, particularly for businesses in the Middle East, was the religious flag, because obviously it is still there. There's the Shia Sunni rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And equally, of course, there's always the possibility of further terrorist strikes in major Western cities. The second flag we call the red flag, because it encompassed 3 countries, Russia, China, and North Korea. And there's still an important flag. I mean, Russia still has sanctions against it from Europe and America because of its annexation of Crimea. But having said that, I think that the idea of a nuclear conflict between America and Russia is unlikely, because Putin and Trump, I think, talk to each other a lot on the phone. There's far more communication between the leadership of the 2 countries than there was 50 years ago. The second country, though, is very important, China, because they've just done what Russia did. They've basically annexed Hong Kong. And one doesn't know what the response ultimately will be because of that. I mean, America's already removed the special status of Hong Kong, and there's talk of allowing people to emigrate from Hong Kong to America. But it doesn't bode well for the future China-America relationship, which is the most important in the world, because they're the first and the second largest economies in the world. And one of the points that I make is that in the long term, just as the 19th century belonged to Britain and the 20th century belonged to America, probably the 21st century in the second half will belong to China. It will become the largest economy in the world. And that is huge because it will mean that the East, for the very first time in 300 or 400 years, will have become the dominant force in the global economy. So it's a very important long-term flag. The third, North Korea, is there because they've got 44, 45 nuclear weapons. They've got the missiles to launch them. And they've got a very unpredictable leader, rather like America. And if it ever comes to war in North Korea, it would have huge consequences for the whole region. Japan, China, Russia, South Korea. I mean, Seoul is just below the North Korean border. And so you obviously have to watch it if you have businesses or investments in the Far East to see whether the possibility of that flag rising very fast in terms of a war in North Korea is actually going to happen. The next flag is, for me, probably one of the most important flags from an investment point of view, which I call the grey flag. It's the aging of the population in certain global economies. Japan now has the oldest population on earth, the highest percentage of people over 65. And I remember Pierre Wack telling me in the mid-80s, he had a Japanese wife, that if Japan ever had a property crash, its economy would never grow again. Because, as he said, old people simply don't produce and consume as much. And he said they are the oldest nation on earth. And in 1990, the property market did crash in Japan. And Japan has never been the same since. It's grown at between 0.5%, 1%, nothing like the 7 to 8% growth rate in the 80s. And the similar deal with Europe. Europe is an aging region. Greece and Italy are following Japan. In fact, Italy has a declining population. And so, you know, there is no way that Europe is ever going to grow really fast again economically. And it's very important because I've always said consistently since 2000 that if you're going to invest somewhere in the world outside South Africa, you should put money in America rather than in the UK or Europe. And I've been proved dead right because on December the 31st, 1999, the FTSE was 6,950. Whereas the FTSE this morning, 6,200. So we've dropped 700 points in 20 years. I mean, how many financial advisors would have told you at the end of 1999, you put money in the UK, you won't have any capital gain after 20 years. Yes, they got the dividends, so you got the dividend yield, but you didn't get any capital gain. America's completely different. At the end of 1999, the Dow Jones was 11,000. It's now 25,000, so it's more than doubled. And it's because America has a younger, more resilient population. So it is a very important flag. For China, their one-child policy that they scrapped recently for a two-child policy, but that one-child policy has turned China into a middle-aged nation. So again, China's economic growth rate is slowing because it's an aging population. So very, very important flag, that one. The next flag, equally important, very cloudy. We talk about clockwork flags like the grey flag ticking away, aging the world's population, and the cloudy flags, which are uncertain and which change shape all the time, so they're unpredictable. It's the anti-establishment flag, which I identified in the book Flag Watching. It was the fact that after the great crash of 2008, the world became a much more unequal place to be. In fact, a book written by a French economist called Thomas Piketty, Capital in the 21st Century, basically said that because investment returns have been much higher than GDP growth for 20 years, the situation was now where the world was back to where it was in 1910 in terms of levels of inequality. And yeah, the super rich are now back to being super rich, but the poor and the middle class are having a really hard time. And if anything has shown that, it's this pandemic, because it really shows that the majority of Americans, the majority of people in Europe, live from hand to mouth. They don't have savings. They may have had savings in the last century, but they don't have savings now. And that is one thing which has really gobsmacked people, is just how little money, the majority of people actually have saved. Whereas, of course, the super rich have got back to being even more super rich. And this has caused a lot of anger. It has changed the political dynamic completely. There's Trump, who was elected. Even though he lost the popular vote, he concentrated on certain key blue-collar states, and he won the election. Even though he's a billionaire himself, he managed to convince people that he stood for the working class against the Washington establishment. Boris Johnson used it very effectively in his Brexit campaign to get votes in the north, because people up north think that London is in a different world, much richer, and don't look after the north. And he managed to funnel that anger into a successful vote on Brexit. And then, of course, he himself got into power. In Europe, you've got lots of populist leaders who are the same. And you can see that it's leading to increased barriers to immigration. The rich old millions, as I like to call the people who live in developed countries, are putting cages over themselves to protect them from the poor young billions who live in the rest of the world. And this goes completely against globalization that really changed the second half of the last century with freedom of movement of people and goods. Now we have the gilded cage. That was even before the pandemic, and now I think the pandemic might even strengthen the bars of that cage. The next flag for young people is the most important flag. It's the green flag of the environment. The fact that it's no longer hundreds of years away. Climate change means that we're going to see extreme weather patterns, already seen extreme weather patterns this century. And you're having extreme droughts, extreme rainfalls, extreme tornadoes. Things are really changing. Sea levels are rising, which means that you're already seeing climate refugees from places like the Marshall Islands. And so one of the biggest priorities when we come out of this pandemic and start rebuilding the world economy will be to ensure that it's that it's oriented towards the green side of things, because as young people say, it's you guys who are creating an unsustainable planet for us, and we're just going to have to stop doing that. So it is a very, very important flag. But the last flag that I mentioned in the book was the pandemic flag, the idea that this century we could have another major pandemic. And I quoted the Black Death of 1346 to 53, which killed 30% of the European population. The Great Plague of 1665, that killed a quarter of London's population before the Great Fire of 1666. I talked of the Spanish flu, which killed between 50 and 100 million people just over 100 years ago. And then I talked of HIV/AIDS, which so far has accounted for the death of 39 million people, and 35 million people are actually living with HIV. Thank heavens they found a very adequate palliative drug, so that it has been turned into something that people can live with. But of course, the one thing that people want has not come about, which is a vaccine. And it shows that one must be careful in saying a vaccine will handle everything. We haven't yet got a vaccine on HIV/AIDS. So given the pandemic flag, what are the scenarios that I wrote in two articles, one at the beginning of March for News 24 and one on April the 20th. Well, I, in the later article, gave four possible scenarios for the pandemic. The first I called Much Ado About Nothing, which was very much around at the beginning of March, and which I repeated again in April, just to basically say to people that it no longer really had a plausible narrative. At the beginning of March, there were lots of experts who said, don't worry about this, it's just an ordinary bout of flu, and it'll be like SARS and MERS, which were earlier epidemics this century based on new viruses. It'll just disappear. And I think that reached up to the presidency in the United States and elsewhere. It was a major belief that it was much ado about nothing. Well, I think that what happened in later March and April showed that it was not much ado about nothing. The absolute chaos of the national health systems in the UK and in America, the overloading of ICU, the lack of ventilators, the lack of protective equipment for nursing staff, it showed that the West was woefully unprepared for this virus. And so, in fact, it has been a major thing, because defense from now on will not just be about defense against a human enemy, it'll be defense against a virus. And so, you know, when you look at the future, I think that public health will become a very big issue in terms of creating a defense system for an entire country. So it's certainly not much ado about nothing, and certainly the current figures of over 600,000 cases, you know, that we've had, and the deaths that we've had, the 6 million cases that we've had, and the 360,000 deaths that we've had in the world, show that it is certainly not a minor pandemic. Having said that, the Hong Kong pandemic of flu, the Hong Kong flu of 68, 69 killed 1 million people, and we certainly haven't reached that statistic yet with the coronavirus. And yes, it's still early days in terms of the pandemic. The second scenario I called the camel's straw, and this is the one that people have to watch very closely, because as the second presentation said, we've got to look after our financial well-being. And the essential part of the camel's straw scenario is that the world was in a fragile state before the pandemic hit. We firstly had the trade war between China and America. China's economic growth rate slowing down, which has really propelled the world economy over the last 10 to 15 years, particularly in terms of commodities, demand and prices. We had this incredible easy money policy following the crash of 2008-9, which meant that interest rates were reduced to virtually zero, but it's led to a lot of additional national debt, corporate debt, and consumer debt. And of course, the relief measures taken during the pandemic, which completely put the relief measures in 2008 in the shade, have added immeasurably to that debt. And in this scenario, that basically comes back and haunts the global economy. And it's actually going to be a much slower process, because the straw was the pandemic, and it did break the camel's back, and it takes a long time for the camel to revive. And so one of the critical variables right now is the length of any recovery. And you've got to watch the flags. You've got to watch, whether inflation rates start rising along with interest rates because of all this debt in the world. There's a huge argument going on amongst economists in the world, from the Keynesians, who believe that you had to put in all this relief, to the monetarists, who basically say it has to lead to inflation. So you have to watch exactly what happens each month in terms of the statistics, and of course the genuine economic statistics like unemployment and GDP growth. And in fact, the IMF says that GDP, global GDP, is going to decline by 2% this year. So essentially, whether the GDP is going to recover or not in the third or fourth quarter. And there's a whole range of basic economic statistics that actually will act as flags to tell you whether the camel straw scenario is in play, or indeed we're in the scenario that the markets have actually recovered on, because they had a very bad March, but markets have recovered in April and so far in May, because the markets believe we're already in a recovery mode, because we're moving out of lockdown in Europe and we're moving out of lockdown in America. The world economy's starting up again, and by the end of this year, it will be firing on all cylinders. So the markets, the Wall Street, the FTSE and other markets are very much into the V scenario, that we're going to be okay at the end of this year, and it'll be all systems go next year. So all I'm saying is the camel straw is not a V, it's a U, and it's a longer U. And the only way that you can say, are the markets ahead of themselves with the V, or is it really the camel straw, is to watch the flags. The third scenario I called Spain again, and it's where you watch the medical flags to see whether we have a second wave in the epidemic, and that it ends up like Spanish flu in the last century and kills tens of millions of people. Again, there is uncertainty over this, whether there will be a second wave. There are people now saying that the death rates have come down quite considerably. The virus may have got milder, and therefore we do not expect a second wave, even with the easing of the lockdown in Europe and America. But we'll just have to wait and see. And obviously the other thing people say is it's a seasonal flu, and therefore it will revive when Europe and America move into the next winter. We don't know much about this virus. We don't know how many people have are asymptomatic, but who are positive for a COVID test. We don't know the long-term medical impact on people of having had COVID, even if they've had it mildly. There's talk about long-term effects of this virus. We don't know the fatality rate of the virus. People put it at around 1%, but the fatality rates between countries, if you compare deaths to cases, ranges from 15% down to less than 1%. So nobody really has a clue at the moment what the fatality rate is. They don't know what the reproduction number, the infection rate is. And so there's just so much uncertainty surrounding this particular virus. And certainly around a vaccine, people talk hopefully that we might have a breakthrough vaccine at the end of this year, coming out of Oxford University, or maybe from a company in America. But most people feel it's 12 to 18 months away, because you've not only got to produce a vaccine, you've got to test it, and once you've tested it, you've got to manufacture it for billions of people. So it will take quite a long time. So the Spain again scenario is in play. It's that we actually do have a serious pandemic. Personally, instinctively, I've lowered the probability on that, because I do think that the medical flags are pointing in a positive direction, that this virus may not come back, even with the easing of lockdown measures, but we will have to see. The last scenario is I call tightrope, because essentially countries have to walk the tightrope between, on the one hand, camel's straw and not having a terrible kind of economic crash. And on the other side, Spain again, and not having a terrible pandemic. And it's a balance between lives and livelihoods. And you've got to balance lives and livelihoods, and you've got to set out along the tightrope. And that's what countries all around the world are doing, including ourselves. And obviously, the positive outcome, the one that we hope, is that we successfully walk to the other side on the tightrope, by which time a vaccine will be available and COVID will go away. And of course, even more hopeful scenario is that COVID gradually goes away anyway, because as some medical scientists are saying, it seems to be less lethal than it was at the outset. So, yeah, we're setting down the tightrope here in South Africa. We're now down to level 3. I totally supported Cyril in his lockdown and doing it early. I equally supported his extension of the lockdown. And I do think it's sensible that we open up. I'm a bit concerned about the confusion in terms of the things that we should do and not do during the opening up. We all know about the cigarettes, but there are plenty of other things that I think people find confusing. But nevertheless, I think that it was a very good thing that we went into lockdown when we did, and now we are opening up our economy again. And that's why all those points made about trying to handle the stress that people have when they come back to work, and obviously also trying to handle their financial well-being, which were put in the 2 previous presentations, is absolutely correct, because it's not just government that walks a tightrope. It's every business is walking a tightrope. Every family is walking a tightrope. And, you know, tightropes imply tension of the rope, but also tension inside. And I think most of us still feel a tension about this virus, a psychological tension, but equally, obviously, we've all taken a hit financially as a result of this virus. So, you know, all the kind of stuff that was mentioned, plus obviously physical distancing in the office, having people working from home as much as possible, staggering times in the office, trying to get away from crowding people into lifts and all this kind of stuff, absolutely correct, because people do not work well under stress, either medical stress or under financial stress. So there is hope. This acrobatic journey that we've started now, balancing between lives and livelihoods, is on its way. It's giving us all hope that we will get back to a level of normality, but it will be a new normal, because I think that there are things which are going to change. I mean, I just look at the social unrest in America right now as a result of the murder of this black man in Minneapolis by the police officer. It really has struck a raw nerve in America and elsewhere in the world. And, you know, for America now to go through 2 crises, the crisis of the virus and the crisis of you know, unrest, civil unrest, which is widespread at the moment in America. It's very uncertain times, and you know, it shows actually that point I made about the flag of inequality is flying high around the world. I have to say that here in South Africa, we had not had the social unrest that people thought we would have when we had lockdown. We did work together as a team. We've had lots of companies and NGOs doing incredible things in terms of providing food in the townships. And so I actually think that we've done very well. Compared to America, we have done much better. And in that sense, it gives me much more hope and confidence living here that we will come out of this pandemic and get back to a new economy. And I certainly think that at the beginning of the new economy, we should have an economic CODESA, and we should be discussing small business entrepreneurs and how we can roll out much more into the sort of what we now at the moment call the informal sector of the economy, because that is the only way we're going to get rid of unemployment over the next 10 years. And I was so pleased that Cyril mentioned that in his last speech, because I've been saying it for a long time. The nature of work has changed. The flag's gone up on work. It's no longer what it was in the last century. We're in the post fourth industrial revolution, whatever it's called, wave. And the only way you're going to create lots of jobs is to go back to small business creation. And that is the one big thing we've got to do to continue the positive momentum that we've had during the pandemic. And I'd like to end with a benediction for all of you who've been listening to this. May the fox be with you. Thank you very much.